No one in the Phoenix courtroom knew who Margaret Hayes really was. A 72-year-old woman, quiet, called as a witness in a wrongful termination case, just another ordinary person. The judge kept warning her to speak louder. Lawyers grew impatient. Spectators fidgeted with boredom. Until Margaret leaned into the microphone and whispered a single call sign, Tribunal-Alpha-One. The room instantly froze, because some names are more powerful than any shout, and Margaret Hayes was the legendary military judge who had presided over the Pentagon's most classified operations. Welcome to Hidden Story, where we uncover the extraordinary authority hiding behind ordinary appearances. Before we dive into this incredible story of whispered power, dismissed expertise, and the moment a courtroom learned that some voices don't need volume to command respect, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because we read and respond to every single one. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us ensure they're never forgotten. The Tuesday morning session in Courtroom 7 of the Phoenix Superior Court was proceeding with typical corporate litigation tedium. The case of Davidson Technologies versus Elena Rodriguez, a wrongful termination lawsuit alleging age and gender discrimination, had been dragging on for 3 weeks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished wood panels and worn carpet. Judge Michael Richardson, 34, was the youngest judge on the Superior Court bench. Fresh from his appointment 6 months earlier, he ran his courtroom with an efficiency that sometimes bordered on impatience. He had little tolerance for witnesses who couldn't project their voices or lawyers who meandered through their questioning. In the back row of the gallery sat Margaret Hayes, a woman who had attended every day of the proceedings. At 72, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made her nearly invisible in a crowd. Silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple navy blazer and sensible shoes. She took careful notes in a small leather journal, but never spoke to anyone. The court clerks had noticed her, of course. The same elderly woman, same seat, same quiet attention to every detail. But in a public courtroom, observers were common. Law students, retired folks with time on their hands, family members of the parties involved. Margaret seemed to fit perfectly into the category of harmless spectator. Elena Rodriguez, the plaintiff, sat at the petitioner's table with her attorney, Sarah Chen. Elena was 58, a former software engineer who claimed she'd been systematically marginalized and eventually terminated because of her age and gender. Her case hinged on proving a pattern of discrimination that Davidson Technologies vehemently denied. What no one in the courtroom knew was that Margaret Hayes had been following the case not out of casual interest, but because she recognized the systematic patterns of institutional bias that she had spent 3 decades dismantling in military tribunals. "The defense calls Margaret Hayes to the stand," announced David Morrison, Elena's attorney, surprising everyone in the courtroom. There was a moment of confusion as heads turned to locate this unexpected witness. Margaret rose from her back row seat with quiet dignity, walking to the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who had done this many times before. Judge Richardson consulted his notes with a frown. "Counselor, I don't see this witness on your list." "Your Honor, Ms. Hayes contacted us yesterday with relevant information regarding the workplace culture at Davidson Technologies. We're calling her as a rebuttal witness." The judge's irritation was visible. "This is highly irregular. Ms. Hayes, please state your name and occupation for the record." Margaret settled into the witness chair and leaned toward the microphone. "Margaret Hayes," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "retired federal employee." Judge Richardson immediately looked annoyed. "Ma'am, you'll need to speak much louder. The court reporter can't transcribe testimony she can't hear." Margaret nodded slightly, but didn't appreciably raise her volume. "Margaret Hayes, retired federal employee." Attorney Morrison began his questioning. "Ms. Hayes, what is your educational background?" "Law degree, Georgetown, master's in judicial administration," she replied, her voice remaining frustratingly soft. "I'm sorry. Could you repeat that?" Morrison asked, leaning closer. Judge Richardson interrupted sharply. "Ms. Hayes, This is the third time I'm asking you to speak up. If you cannot project your voice sufficiently for these proceedings, we'll need to excuse you from testimony." Margaret looked directly at him with calm, measuring eyes. "I understand, Your Honor." But her volume remained unchanged as Morrison continued his questions about her observations of workplace dynamics and organizational behavior patterns. Each answer was delivered in the same quiet, measured tone that forced everyone in the courtroom to strain to hear. Defense attorney Patricia Walsh approached for cross-examination with barely concealed frustration. A senior partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious firms, she had little patience for witnesses who couldn't follow basic courtroom protocol. "Ms. Hayes," Walsh began, her own voice deliberately loud, "you claim to have insights into workplace discrimination. What exactly qualifies you to testify as an expert in employment law?" Margaret's response was typically quiet. "I've observed institutional bias patterns for many years. Could you speak up, please?" Walsh demanded. "And could you be more specific about your qualifications?" "Objection," Morrison called. "The witness is testifying to her observations, not offering expert opinion." "Sustained," Judge Richardson ruled, though his patience was clearly wearing thin. "Ms. Hayes, for the final time, you must speak loudly enough for the court to hear you clearly." Margaret nodded, but continued speaking in the same soft tone. "I observed patterns of systematic exclusion at Davidson Technologies that mirror institutional discrimination I've encountered in other contexts." Walsh pressed harder. "What other contexts? Where exactly did you work in the federal government?" "Various assignments," Margaret replied quietly. "That's not an answer," Walsh said sharply. "Were you a clerk, an administrator? What gives you any authority to comment on discrimination patterns?" Judge Richardson leaned forward, his frustration boiling over. "Ms. Hayes, if you cannot or will not speak at an audible volume, I'm going to hold you in contempt of court. This is my final warning." The courtroom had grown completely silent, everyone straining to hear Margaret's responses. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, waiting for testimony she could actually transcribe. Margaret Hayes looked up at Judge Richardson with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the proceeding. She leaned slightly toward the microphone, and in a voice that was still barely above a whisper, she spoke 4 words that changed everything. "Tribunal-Alpha-One, requesting standby." The effect was immediate and profound. Judge Richardson's face went white. The court reporter's hands froze over her stenography machine. Defense attorney Walsh took an involuntary step backward. In the gallery, a retired military officer who had been observing the trial stood up abruptly, his face showing shock and recognition. Margaret continued in the same quiet voice, but now every person in the courtroom was hanging on her every word. "For 30 years, I presided over military tribunals involving cases of institutional discrimination, sexual harassment, and abuse of authority. I held the rank of Brigadier General in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. My call sign was Tribunal-Alpha-One." Judge Richardson's gavel slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the bench. "General Hayes," he whispered, his voice barely more audible than hers had been. Margaret continued with the same measured delivery. "I was the senior military judge for 3 decades of high-profile court-martial proceedings. I've reviewed thousands of cases involving systematic discrimination and abuse of power. When I observed the proceedings in this courtroom and the patterns described in Ms. Rodriguez's testimony, I recognized the same institutional behaviors I spent my career addressing." The courtroom remained frozen in absolute silence. Attorney Walsh stood motionless, her cross-examination forgotten. Attorney Morrison looked stunned. He had no idea his witness possessed such credentials. "General Hayes," Judge Richardson said, finding his voice again, "I apologize for not recognizing your credentials. Why didn't you identify yourself initially?" Margaret's smile was slight but unmistakable. "Because, Your Honor, I wanted to see how this courtroom would treat a witness based solely on her appearance and demeanor rather than her rank or title. The result was quite illuminating." The retired military officer in the gallery approached the bar. Your Honor, request permission to address the court. I'm Colonel James Patterson, retired. I served under General Hayes for 5 years. She presided over the most significant military justice reforms in modern history. Judge Richardson nodded, still visibly shaken. Permission granted. Colonel Patterson faced the courtroom. General Hayes established precedents for addressing institutional discrimination that are still taught in military law schools today. Her rulings protected countless service members from the exact type of systematic bias being discussed in this case. Margaret spoke again, her voice remaining soft but now commanding absolute attention. The patterns I observed in Ms. Rodriguez's workplace mirror those I encountered in military environments where discrimination was embedded in the culture rather than being the result of individual bad actors. She turned to face the defense table. The exclusion from key meetings, the questioning of technical competence based on age and gender, the gradual marginalization until termination became inevitable. These are textbook examples of institutional discrimination. Attorney Walsh found her voice again. General Hayes, with respect, military courts operate under different standards than civilian employment law. That's true, Margaret replied quietly. Military courts operate under stricter standards. Behavior that might be tolerated in civilian workplaces would result in court-martial proceedings in the military. Judge Richardson leaned back in his chair, visibly processing this revelation. General Hayes, you've essentially been conducting an observation of these proceedings from a judicial perspective. Yes, Your Honor. Old habits. And your assessment? Margaret looked directly at him, her expression serious but not condescending. Your Honor, you demonstrated the same pattern of bias toward me that Ms. Rodriguez experienced in her workplace. Because I didn't conform to your expectations of how a witness should present herself, you threatened to hold me in contempt rather than recognizing that effective communication takes many forms. The words hung in the air like a gentle rebuke. Judge Richardson's face reddened, but not with anger, with embarrassment and recognition. You're suggesting that my treatment of you reflects systemic bias? I'm stating that when authority figures make assumptions based on appearance, age, or presentation style, they perpetuate the same discrimination patterns that created the hostile workplace Ms. Rodriguez experienced. Attorney Morrison finally found his voice. General Hayes, based on your expertise, do you believe Davidson Technologies engaged in systematic discrimination? Based on the evidence presented and the patterns I've observed, yes. The documentation shows a clear progression of marginalization tactics designed to force Ms. Rodriguez's resignation without creating obvious legal liability. Margaret reached into her small purse and withdrew a thin folder. I took the liberty of reviewing the public court documents in this case. The patterns are consistent with dozens of military cases I've adjudicated involving institutional discrimination. She opened the folder and removed several pages. These are precedent cases from military tribunals where similar fact patterns resulted in findings of systematic discrimination. While military law differs from employment law, the behavioral patterns and institutional responses are virtually identical. Defense Attorney Walsh objected. Your Honor, this witness cannot introduce new evidence during testimony. Judge Richardson looked at Margaret with newfound respect. General Hayes, are you offering these as examples for comparison rather than as evidence? Correct, Your Honor. I'm providing context based on my 3 decades of judicial experience with institutional discrimination cases. As Margaret's testimony continued, the transformation in the courtroom was remarkable. The same quiet voice that had frustrated Judge Richardson minutes earlier now commanded absolute respect and attention. Court personnel sat straighter. Attorneys took careful notes. Spectators leaned forward to catch every word. General Hayes, Judge Richardson said formally, I owe you an apology. My treatment of you earlier reflected exactly the kind of bias you're describing. Margaret's response was gracious. Your Honor, recognition is the first step toward change. The fact that you can acknowledge it demonstrates growth. She turned to address the broader courtroom. Throughout my military career, I learned that the most effective authority often speaks quietly. Real power doesn't need to shout. When institutions or individuals feel compelled to use volume, threats, or intimidation, it usually indicates weakness rather than strength. Elena Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "General Hayes, that's exactly what I experienced at Davidson. The louder they became about my supposed inadequacies, the more it revealed their own insecurities about having an experienced woman in a senior technical role." Margaret nodded. "Ms. Rodriguez, your experience aligns with patterns I've seen repeatedly. When institutions engage in systematic discrimination, they often become increasingly aggressive in their justifications as the evidence mounts against them." Attorney Walsh made one final attempt. "General Hayes, don't you think it's possible that Ms. Rodriguez simply wasn't performing adequately and that her termination was based on legitimate business concerns?" Margaret considered the question carefully before responding. "Ms. Walsh, in 30 years of reviewing discrimination cases, I've learned to examine the totality of evidence rather than accepting institutional explanations at face value. The documentation in this case shows a clear pattern of shifting justifications, retroactive performance concerns, and selective application of standards. These are hallmarks of discriminatory intent." As Margaret's testimony concluded, Judge Richardson made an unprecedented statement. "General Hayes, your testimony has been illuminating, both regarding this case and regarding my own conduct. I want to thank you for your service and for your patience with this court's initial failure to recognize your expertise." Margaret stood to leave the witness stand, but Colonel Patterson approached once more. "Your Honor, if I may, General Hayes never sought recognition for her service. She retired quietly, declined numerous prestigious appointments, and has spent her retirement observing how justice is administered in civilian courts. The fact that she chose to testify in this case speaks to her continued commitment to fighting institutional discrimination." As Margaret returned to her seat in the gallery, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely changed. What had begun as a routine employment discrimination case had become a master class in recognizing bias and respecting authority that comes in unexpected forms. Judge Richardson addressed the court. "These proceedings have reminded me that wisdom and authority often present themselves quietly, and that our legal system is strongest when we listen carefully to all voices, regardless of how softly they speak." Elena Rodriguez approached Margaret during the recess. "General Hayes, I can't thank you enough. For 30 years, I felt like no one understood what I was experiencing. Your testimony made me feel heard." Margaret's response was characteristic. "Ms. Rodriguez, your courage in pursuing this case, despite institutional pressure, demonstrated the same strength I saw in military personnel who stood up to discrimination. That takes remarkable character." As the court session ended, word spread quickly through the courthouse about the legendary military judge who had been sitting quietly in courtroom 7 for weeks. But Margaret Hayes left as she had arrived, quietly, with dignity, having made her point not through volume or dramatics, but through the simple power of truth spoken softly by someone who had earned the right to be heard. Later that week, Judge Richardson issued a formal ruling in favor of Elena Rodriguez, citing not only the evidence presented, but also expert testimony regarding patterns of institutional discrimination. The case became a landmark decision in employment law, frequently cited for its recognition that discrimination often operates through systematic exclusion rather than overt hostility. Margaret Hayes returned to her quiet retirement, but her impact on that courtroom, and on everyone present, remained profound. She had demonstrated that true authority doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard, and that the most powerful truths are often spoken by those who are easy to overlook.